Welcome to the second and final part of the Other Railway Visitors video. Last week I covered the engines that did the roles of Thomas, Edward, Henry and Gordon. Today I'm following up on that video by covering the final three engines. I would definitely recommend watching the first video to make sure you're up to speed. There should be a card somewhere in the video, but if you have already watched part 1 then you know the drill, so I'd better get started. In the last video, all the engines I covered were based at Barrow-in-Furness during 1956. For the other engines in this video I've gone further afield, although this particular engine was also a Barrow resident at the time. My line of thinking is that the other railway probably weren't overly fussed about loaning too many top link or high profile engines to the North Western Railway. They figured that a Black 5 and a Jubilee were quite capable of hauling mainline passenger work by themselves, thank you very much. So for James's stand-in, they lent their scrappiest 060 to assist Stan the Black 5 with goods work. This happened to be a Furness Railway D5 number 52501, known to her friends as Fern. Now you may remember from the previous video that Edward was lumbered with mentoring a rather bratty LMS 440 called Tula. Tula was used to mainline passenger work and did not take well to the job she was expected to do in Edward's absence. Edward's patience was wearing thin, his kind demeanour hanging on by a thread. Tula had just insulted him and his branch line after being told that she had to shunt her own trains. Edward was about to blow an angry peep peep on his whistle when he heard a different whistle in the distance. It didn't belong to a Sodor engine, but all the same Edward couldn't shake off the idea that it sounded familiar. It was just as well that he couldn't, as the whistle belonged to Fern. She and Edward had known each other during the old days before Edward came to Sodor. The two engines were delighted to see each other again after all these years. Fern had just double-headed a train with James from Tidmouth to Wellsworth. She wanted to have a look round the yards because she thought she'd spotted an old friend. Even after a repaint and several extensive rebuilds, she was able to recognise Edward, and Edward recognised Fern. He forgot to be cross, and the two engines updated each other on all the things that had happened in the last 40 years or so. Fern suggested that she switch places with Tula, which Edward agreed with as quick as a flash. After making arrangements with the Fat Controller, Tula went to work on the main line as James's stand-in, and Edward showed Fern around his branch line. This was a much more pleasant experience for Edward. He did feel a bit sorry for James, who ended up getting lumbered with Tula through no fault of his own, but since James's regular jobs were more akin to the work she was used to back home, she didn't give James as much grief as she could have done. And so, here is the finished picture. Pug is the other engine aside from Ginty who is mentioned by name in the original story. He only shows up in one illustration, however, and the only thing we know about him is that he's one of Percy's friends along with Ginty. He is based on an LMS Kitson 040 saddle tank engine, more specifically one of the first 5 members of the class, with longer saddle tanks and shorter coal bunkers. These engines were not stationed at Barrow-in-Furness as far as I'm aware. In fact, from what I can gather they mainly hung around Derbyshire, which makes the Kitson locomotives a peculiar choice to base Pug on. In the video on Percy's mainland buddies, I brought up the possibility that engines travelled from various sheds across the other railway to Barrow, specifically to meet Percy and hear his stories. Perhaps this could explain why Pug was brought to Sodor. He came to Barrow to hear Percy's stories and make friends with him, only to end up, either intentionally or unintentionally, being brought to Sodor to help out whilst the Fat Controller's engines are away. Whilst the Fat Controller's railway had 8 engines at the time the story was set, only 7 engines came to fill in for them whilst they were gone. I think the most logical explanation is that Percy and Toby's role was allocated to a single engine, that engine being Pug. Like Ginty, Pug had mainly only performed shunting duties before coming to Sodor and was eager to try something a bit different. Unlike Ginty, who wasn't 100% confident and made a few mistakes during their time on Sodor, Pug took to his new work placement like a duck to water. Percy and Toby were still there to guide him on his first day, of course, but it was almost as if Pug already knew what he had to do before being told. As previously mentioned, Pug did Toby's work as well as Percy's, meaning he would have had to work the quarry tram road. One question perhaps worth asking is whether or not he would have needed cowcatchers and side plates when on the line. I guess it depends on whether or not the angry policeman was still stationed at Farquhar at the time the story is set. He was the only one who was continuing to enforce this particular law by that point, the law itself being outdated. We know that by the early 60s the policeman had been relocated, since Percy is allowed to go on the quarry in Percy's predicament without getting buffer-cuffed. I suppose it could go either way for Pug. But anyway, here's Pug bringing a train of stone trucks to the harbour, with Percy and Toby there to give words of encouragement. And, with all that said, here is the finished picture. And finally, it's time to talk about duck standing. When researching the engines stationed at Barrow-in-Furness during 1956, the only tank engines I could find reference to were Ginty's, which would be a bit repetitive, and LMS 264 tanks, which would have been far too big for a stationed pilot. I then decided to have a look at nearby sheds in the north of England, hoping to find something a little out of the ordinary. I noticed that Carlisle Canal had some ex-North British Railway 062 tanks on shed, and so I figured that one of these could perhaps do Duck's work whilst he's away. Duck didn't think too much of Rory when he arrived. Nevertheless, he decided to do what any engine would have done in his brake shoes and teach Rory what he needed to do in a comprehensive manner. Being Duck, he decided to teach Rory how to do things the Great Western way. "Oh, and bile your head," chuckled Rory. "I've been shunting trains since before you was built, and I've never needed any Great Western way to put me in my place." Despite being stationed at Carlisle, Rory was still fiercely Scottish. Duck was shocked. "All right then," he replied when he found his voice. "You shunt your trains your way, and I'll shunt my trains mine, but don't come crying to me when you mess up." He needn't have said it though, as it turned out that Rory's methods of shunting was not a world away from the way Duck shunted trains. In fact, their methods were practically the same as one another. With the two engines working parallel to each other, the yard was tidied up in double quick time, and the coaches and trucks alike behaved splendidly. Duck apologised to Rory for misjudging him. "Ach, dinna fash yourself, laddie," came the reply. "You're no such a bad wee engine either." The two engines became friends after that, and Duck had gained a newfound respect for Scottish engines. This was just as well, given that it would only be a few years before two of them would take permanent residence on the Fat Controller's railway. And, with that said and done, here is the finished drawing. And there you have it, all 7 engines from the other railway that came to Sodor accounted for, over the course of 2 videos. It's been interesting figuring out what engines these may have been and how they would have interacted with the engines of Sodor. I hope you've enjoyed the drawings too, as well as my backstories for the engines. Make sure to like, comment and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you next week.